I can't stand this new media spin. They say, did Joe Biden's rhetoric radicalize the guy who tried to shoot Trump? The only person Joe Biden has ever made me want to shoot is myself. I don't know if you saw the interview, Lester Holt was like, Mr. President Biden, when you said, and I'm quoting here, unintelligible, bullseye falls asleep. Now, I've been trying to write stuff about, after Saturday. People say you can joke about the assassination attempt, but expect a knock from the FBI. And I'm like, really? It doesn't seem like they could even cover one rally. How scared am I supposed to be? I think if the FBI follows me, it's probably the only time I can get an agent to one of my shows. Right now, the FBI, they said they're trying to figure out the shooter's motive. Imagine a group of 25 adults going, why would someone... Let's get another whiteboard in here, guys. Liberals fucking suck. We fucking suck, man. We called this guy a Nazi for the last 8 years, and then the moment someone tried to shoot him and missed, we said, oh, we wish him a speedy recovery. I swear to God, if the DNC was around in 1945, after Hitler killed himself, we would have been like, guys, check in on your friends. You don't know who's struggling right now. I can't...
Good morning. It's Thursday, Bad News Thursday, July the 18th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have the patriotic shorts, motivation, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 strategies of war, and bad news. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now we've got the tail end of Maria Bartiromo's show and then Stuart Varney with the headlines.
It's fascinating to me. You've been covering business for so long, how the Silicon Valley guys have stepped up to be the power brokers in politics. It's a trade from Wall Street.
True, Mac. I think the face of the Republican Party is going to continue to change, Maria, and it's exciting to see the unity that we're going to see on stage today.
Cheryl.
Well, I think tonight is going to be the culmination of what, as a viewer, I can tell all of you, I know that you're there, has just been an incredible showing by the RNC. They should be very proud.
All right, we will leave it there. Great show, everybody. We so appreciate your time. Mahat Cook, Morgan Ortegas, Cheryl Casoni. Have a great day, everybody. We'll see you again tomorrow morning. Company picks it up now. Stu, take it away.
Good morning, Maria. Good morning, everyone. There is a growing list of top Democrats trying to get the president to step aside. The movement is gaining momentum. Nancy Pelosi has told him privately that he has to go because he can't beat Trump, and with him at the top of the ticket, the Democrats lose any chance of retaking the House. Meanwhile, the president has COVID and is now in isolation. He had trouble climbing the stairs to Air Force One. We do not know how long his recovery will take or what shape he'll be in when he returns. With 109 days to the election, the Democrats are in crisis. They are deeply divided. In sharp contrast, the Republicans are united. A resurgent Donald Trump will accept the nomination tonight. Imagine the split screen. An energetic Trump takes the stage while the president stumbles into isolation. On the markets, a modest bounce for tech stocks after big losses Wednesday. The Nasdaq had its worst day in almost 2 years. This morning, the Dow's down maybe 100 points at the opening bell, but look at the Nasdaq, up about 150. Interest rates, the 10-year Treasury yields 4.18%. The 2-year Treasury yields, let me read it, 4.45%. The price of gold staying pretty close to its all-time high, I think maybe another high, $24.67 per ounce. Oil, $82 a barrel and change. Gas down 1 cent at $3.50. Diesel down 1 cent at $3.84. Politics. J.D. Vance gave a very personal speech to the Republican convention. He told of a difficult childhood. He introduced his mother, who is 10 years out of addiction. The crowd loved her and him. On the show today, sharp questions for the Secret Service. How come no press briefings? It's been 5 days since the assassination attempt. How come the shooter was spotted almost an hour before he fired, but was not taken out? Senators became angry when the director of the Secret Service refused to answer their questions. She got the job with help from First Lady Jill Biden. It is Thursday, July 18th, 2024.
And that was the Bloody Tourist with the headlines. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Stuart Varney's My Take.
Now this. Things are moving fast. 24 hours ago, it seemed that the move to take the president off the ticket had stalled. Wrong. The way things are going, Biden might be gone in a week. A few days ago, Biden said he might step aside if he was told he had a medical condition. Well, he does have a medical condition. He's got COVID. Maybe that's why he had so much trouble climbing the stairs to Air Force One. So he will be in isolation, out of action for several days. He's 81, and we don't know how well he can recover. Meanwhile, the Democrats' top leadership is moving very quickly to get him out. Nancy Pelosi reportedly told Biden he can't beat Trump, and he will ruin the Democrats' chances of winning back the House. Senate Leader Schumer, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, they've told him the same thing. And California Democrat Adam Schiff says the Democrats will lose in a landslide with Biden on the ticket. Perhaps worse, the king of the mega donors, Jeffrey Katzenberg, says the money has dried up. In short, the party, the donors, and the media have all turned against him, and now he's in isolation with COVID. That's a pretty good reason for him to call it quits. But even if he does leave, the Democrats still have a political mess on their hands. What to do with Vice President Harris? Only she can take the hundreds of millions of dollars in the Biden-Harris campaign treasure trove, move her aside, and the money disappears. And a large chunk of the Democrat Party would be in open revolt if a black woman were dropped. If she does go to the top of the ticket, it's very hard to see her beating Trump. What a situation. A resurgent Trump survives an assassin bullet, an ailing president isolated with COVID while his desperate party maneuvers to get him out as soon as possible. He may be gone in a week. Second hour of Varney just getting started.
And that was Stuart Varney's My Take. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, the patriotic shorts.
Ukraine has won and Russia has conceded defeat in the naval war. Ukraine, who notably doesn't have a navy, has forced Russia to withdraw its remaining fleet from Crimea to occupy Georgia, reportedly sinking or damaging over half of the Black Sea Fleet's warships, including a submarine, which resulted in the fleet being declared functionally inactive. And this is pretty devastating for Russia because warships are some of the most expensive assets a country has. I mean, they take a decade to make and even longer to make operational. And now you have experts at the Atlantic Council saying that this proves that Russia's threats and red lines are empty. Ukraine was supposed to be nuked and launched into outer space, but instead, Putin quietly ordered his forces to retreat after a humiliating defeat. And earlier this year, it flew under the radar, but Ukraine broke Russia's blockade of the Black Sea, allowing imports and exports to flow freely.
Behind me, the Mark 14 Spitfire. You may notice quite a bit different to the previous Merlin engine Spitfires that we've been looking at. It's because it's powered by the Rolls-Royce Griffon. The Rolls-Royce Merlin up to the Mark 9 and the Mark 16 and the Mark 8 Spitfire have been tuned to about as far as it could go with 1,700 horsepower. But Rolls-Royce had developed the 36.9-litre V12 Griffon, nearly 10 litres bigger, over 2,000 horsepower, a 5-bladed propeller to power it, initially in the Mark 12 Spitfire, but mainly into squadron service as a Mark 14. Now, this aeroplane now equaled just about anything with a propeller at the front that the Germans could put in the sky, going through the air at nearly 450 miles an hour. Really, I don't care how powerful your piston engine is, with a huge 12 or 13-foot fan at the front of your aeroplane, you're not going to go through the air much quicker than that.
Blackbird engines are remarkable because they are able to fly on continuous afterburner, which is what is able to make the aircraft go so fast.
The engines for the airplane are Pratt & Whitney J58. One-of-a-kind engine, no other aircraft uses them. It's the only engine I know of in the world that is certified for 100% all the time continuous afterburner operation. Most jets like the T-38, F4, and probably many others, they have some kind of a time limitation. They can't be an afterburner the entire time.
Blackbird's predominantly made from titanium, which is a metal that can withstand great heat and pressure. It's painted a black colour to help disrupt radar, but also, as you may be able to see, there's a few gaps in between, and that's because the aircraft expands as it is in flight, as it gets very hot. When it lands on the ground after a flight, it then contracts, and as a result, ground crews used to complain about how much oil and fuel the aircraft used to leak.
On September 5th, 1983, several KC-10s and KC-135s, along with some 24 F-4 jets, were crossing the Atlantic. Each F-4 needed 8 refuelings on their route to Europe, when one jet on its 4th refueling suffered an engine failure. The F-4 tilted at 45 degrees, and the crew in the middle of the ocean decided to fly 500 miles to Canada. They dropped their fuel tanks in hope for good, but their hydraulic system failed. The KC-135 crew decided to save the F-4 and slowed down their tanker to 230 miles an hour and lowered their landing gear. They attached the F-4 to their refueling boom and began transferring fuel. The F-4 unlinked from the boom sometimes, but both sides connected it again and again all the way. In the end, the tanker successfully towed the F-4 Phantom to Gander Airport in Newfoundland, Canada. The KC-135 crew received the Mackay Trophy, the USAF's award for the most meritorious flight of the year.
Why is it that U.S. fighter jets are gray, but Russian and Chinese jets are camouflaged? Let me explain. Most people think that U.S. fighter jets are painted gray, since it blends in against the sky and ground. If the Air Force wants to create a real stealth fighter like the F-22 Raptor, they have to use this color. Radar-absorbing paint comes in only one color, but there are problems with this. On a clear day, gray is one of the easiest colors to see from a distance, and this is why some Russian jets have a light blue camouflage color scheme. Unlike gray, blue allows the fighter to disappear into the sky much quicker from a distance. When two planes are at the same height and the pilots can see each other, light blue is the best color. But if the blue fighter is below an enemy jet, it will stand out against the ground. However, Russia's new fighter jets are actually painted to look smaller. Most of the jet is painted similar to U.S. fighters, but there's a thick, light gray outline that will blend in with the sky, making it look smaller and further away than it really is.
And that was the Patriotic Shorts. Back in a minute. Thank you. The following is one of my voiceover demos. If you're a voiceover artist and you would like to advertise one of your demos on my podcast, please send an MP3 to thedrill12, all one word, at gmail.com. That's thedrill12 at gmail.com. Back in a minute.
Americans love scenery. We want to see it all, from one coast to the next, Mount Rushmore down to the Everglades. So hop into a Chevy Malibu and take the scenic route. It's the car you knew America could build. There's a place where people count on friendships they can trace back generations, where they can count on the same stool at the coffee shop waiting for them every morning. This place is called Glen Ellen, and you can find it in every bottle of Glen Ellen wine. This is craft brewed Herman Joseph's, the smoothest, easiest drinking specialty beer in the entire solar system. And I believe you'll find drinkable in the dictionary right after don't order a beer you can't drink. Zoingo! Boingo! The freestyle pogo with more boing, more bounce. Bounce further, bounce higher with Zoingo Boingo. To see what makes Arrowhead Mountain Spring water different from those other waters, you have to go back to the source. And with Arrowhead, that means going back a little farther and longer than most. Between security challenged and security strengthened, there's one important word: how. And it is the how that makes all the difference to our nation and our world. Lockheed Martin. We never forget who we're working for. What makes Kraft Singles so good? 2 out of every 3 kids don't get the recommended amount of calcium. But with Kraft Singles, they get a good source of calcium and the taste they love. Kraft Singles. Magic every single time. Throw boring overboard with a new real meal from Long John Silver's. A meal worthy of a plate, just $4.99. Only at Long John Silver's. We may not all be geniuses, but we can all do something smart. Introducing the Hyundai 199 Sonata Lease. It's a smart deal on a really smart car.
Thank you. Now, a little motivation.
My life, I'm in charge here, and nothing out there is going to stop me. Don't allow life to play you. You must play life. You need to ask yourself, what makes it worth for me to keep going? What's my why? Write down the reasons why you deserve your dream. Let them be your anchor, your unwavering force that keeps you steady in the storm. When your reasons for getting it done are strong enough, you'll get through anything that stands in your way. And you gotta remind yourself, your current situation is not your final destination. It's just a phase, and it will pass. The key to overcoming fear and adversity is to keep moving. No matter how slow, no matter how painful, you've got to grind every day. Don't be seduced by the easy path. Choose the hard one, for it leads to greatness. Let your dreams be so vivid, so tangible that you can taste them, imagine them, live them in your mind, and then bring them into reality. Your dreams should be so powerful that they pull you through the toughest of times. Take responsibility for your life. Decide that no matter what happens, you will not be defeated. You will not quit. You've come too far to give up now. Your character is defined not in comfort and convenience, but in challenge and controversy.
So stand up for what you believe in. Push through the pain, the fear, the doubt. Fight for your dreams, for your destiny. And know without a shred of doubt that you are capable of overcoming anything life throws your way.
As you take charge of your life, as you continue to walk into your next level, everybody won't see it and everybody won't get it, but it's not meant for them to get. Most of this world lacks faith, and a lot of us, faith is like the opposite for us. We have to see it to believe it, but we know faith is having vision in the unseen. Faith is having knowing in the unknown. And so it's time for you to walk that journey and trust the vision that's been given to you. And I want you to give it to the world. Life is going to happen.
And you're going to set up a plan, and you're going to have a vision, and you're going to hope that it's going to turn out perfect. But what so often happens in life is that things get burned, and things go the wrong way. And it's in that moment that you're going to have to choose your reaction. You have a choice to make. Do you have the right reaction, or do you have the wrong reaction? Some of us were tempted, I'll just lay here, and it will pass over me. I'm telling you, you will be in a vicious cycle forever. You have to get up.
Some of you have been knocked out by life, and you got up and saw the blood. He hit me. Sometimes in life, you have to hit back. Recycle your pain. Get something from it. You already in pain. Use it. Do something with it. Allow it to take you to the next level. Allow your pain to push you to greatness. What's your why? You need a why. Why do you need a why? Because some days you're going to say, I don't want to get up. But that why is going to say, push yourself. Get up. Your mama needs you. Your daddy needs you. Your children need you. Get up. Your why is going to push you when you can't push yourself. When you want to quit and give up, your why is going to give you that edge you need, that advantage you need, that lift that you need to get to the next level. Your why. You better go inside. You still looking outside for the stuff that's already inside. You still looking for someone to save you when you already your superhero. You looking for some information from somebody when you already got what you need in your head. It's just time for you to get up and be the best version of you. You've been doing it for 5 years and it don't look like you think. You put all your money in it. You put all your time in it. People are looking at you crazy. 5 years you've invested. You have absolutely nothing to do with what happened to you. It's not your fault. You got knocked on the ground. You had absolutely nothing to do with that. And I'm not blaming you for that. But if I come back a week later, you're still on the ground. That's your fault. If I come back a year later, you still on the ground, that's your fault. If you get knocked down, there's nothing you can do about it. But getting back up has every single thing to do with you. And you will promise me that from this day forward, you will not be defeated.
There is a power in you that can enable you to be stronger and better than anything that's out here. Once you begin to know who you are, once you discover this power, the perfect essence of who you are, that's in all of us, that's permeating our being, that enable us to be the directors of our lives. It will set you free from believing, I can't see myself doing any better. That you truly can live a healthy, happy, prosperous life, and that you can make it in what are called the worst of times. Tough times never last, but tough people do. And you are tough. You're made of some special stuff.
And that was a little bit of motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Daily Stoic.
Wherever you go, there your choice is. A podium and a prison is each a place, one high and the other low. But in either place, your freedom of choice can be maintained if you so wish. Epictetus, Discourses 2.6.25. The Stoics all held vastly different stations in life. Some were rich, some were born at the bottom of Rome's rigid hierarchy. Some had it easy, and others had it unimaginably hard. This is true for us as well. We all come to philosophy from different backgrounds, and even within our own lives, we experience bouts of good fortune and bad fortune. But in all circumstances, adversity or advantage, we really have just one thing we need to do. Focus on what is in our control as opposed to what is not. Right now, we might be laid low with struggles, whereas just a few years ago we might have lived high on the hog. And in just a few days we might be doing so well that success is actually a burden. One thing will stay constant, our freedom of choice, both in the big picture and the small picture. Ultimately, this is clarity. Whoever we are, wherever we are, what matters is our choices. What are they? How will we evaluate them? How will we make the most of them? Those are the questions life asks us, regardless of our station. How will you answer?
And that was the Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Bishop Robert Barron.
One of my pet peeves is this claim in the culture that religion and science are diametrically opposed. In fact, it really bugs me that in study after study, young people often say the number one reason they leave the church is that science has refuted religion. A lot of people succumb to this modern myth, and it is distinctively modern, that religion and science are at loggerheads. There's so many great figures in the history of science that have been devout believers. My favorite example being Georges Lemaitre, the formulator of the Big Bang theory of cosmic origins, which everybody believes today. He's a Catholic priest. I want to tell the counter story and then get that word out into the country.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, "There has never been a philosophy, a theory, or a doctrine that attacked or limited reason, which did not also preach submission to the power of some authority. Power seekers have always known that if men are to be made submissive, the obstacle is not their feelings, their wishes, or their instincts, but their minds. If men are to be ruled, then the enemy is reason." Unquote. And that is Ayn Rand from the chapter The Comprachicos from Return of the Primitive. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the 33 Strategies of War.
Interpretation. Once retired to his farm, Machiavelli had the requisite time and distance to think deeply about those matters that concerned him most. First, he slowly formulated the political philosophy that had long been brewing in his mind. To Machiavelli, the ultimate good was a world of dynamic change in which cities or republics were reordering and revitalizing themselves in perpetual motion. The greatest evil was stagnation and complacency. The agents of healthy change were what he called new princes. Young, ambitious people, part lion, part fox, conscious or unconscious enemies of the established order. Second, Machiavelli analyzed the process by which new princes rose to the heights of power and often fell from it. Certain patterns were clear. The need to manage appearances, to play upon people's belief systems, and sometimes to take decidedly amoral action. Machiavelli craved the power to spread his ideas and advice. Denied this power through politics, he set out to win it through books. He would convert readers to his cause, and they would spread his ideas, witting or unwitting carriers. Machiavelli knew that the powerful are often reluctant to take advice, particularly from someone apparently beneath them. He also knew that many of those not in power might be frightened by the dangerous aspects of his philosophy, that many readers would be attracted and repelled at the same time. The powerless want power but are afraid of what they might have to do to get it. To win over the resistant and ambivalent, Machiavelli's books would have to be strategic, indirect, and crafty. So he devised unconventional rhetorical tactics to penetrate deep behind his readers' defenses. First, he filled his books with indispensable advice, practical ideas on how to get power, stay in power, protect one's power. That draws in readers of all kinds, for all of us think first of our own self-interest. Also, no matter how much a reader resists, he or she realizes that ignoring this book and its ideas might be dangerous. Next, Machiavelli stitched historical anecdotes throughout his writing to illustrate his ideas. People like to be shown ways to fancy themselves modern Caesars or Medicis, and they like to be entertained by a good story. And a mind captivated by a story is relatively undefended and open to suggestion. Readers barely notice that in reading these stories, or rather in reading Machiavelli's cleverly altered versions of them, they are absorbing ideas. Machiavelli also quoted classical writers, adjusting the quotations to suit his purposes. His dangerous counsels and ideas would be easier to accept if they seemed to be emerging from the mouth of a Livy or a Tacitus. Finally, Machiavelli used stark, unadorned language to give his writing movement. Instead of finding their minds slowing and stopping, his readers are infected with the desire to go beyond thought and take action. His advice is often expressed in violent terms, but this works to rouse his readers from their stupor. It also appeals to the young, the most fertile ground from which new princes grow. He left his writing open-ended, never telling people exactly what to do. They must use their own ideas and experiences with power to fill in his writing, becoming complicit partners in the text. Through these various devices, Machiavelli gained power over his readers while disguising the nature of his manipulations. It is hard to resist what you cannot see. Understand, you may have brilliant ideas, the kind that could revolutionize the world, but unless you can express them effectively, they will have no force, no power to enter people's minds in a deep and lasting way. You must focus not on yourself or on the need you feel to express what you have to say, but on your audience, as intently as a general focuses on the enemy he is strategizing to defeat. When dealing with people who are bored and have short attention spans, you must entertain them, sneaking your ideas in through the back door. With leaders, you must be careful and indirect, perhaps using third parties to disguise the source of the ideas you are trying to spread. With the young, your expression must be more violent. In general, your words must have movement, sweeping readers along, never calling attention to their own cleverness. You are not after personal expression, but power and influence. The less people consciously focus on the communicative form you have chosen, the less they realize how far your dangerous ideas are burrowing into their minds. By Niccolo Machiavelli, in a letter to Francesco Guicciardini.
And that was the 33 Strategies of War from by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. So if you're a Democrat, you should vote Republican because there are things that don't disappear. Violence is one of them. Modernity is not distinguished by an aversion to violence. Violence is simply protean. It varies its outward form according to the social constellation at hand. Today, it is shifting from the visible to the invisible, from the frontal to the viral, from brute force to mediated force, from the real to the virtual, from the physical to the psychological, from the negative to the positive, withdrawing into the subcutaneous, subcommunicative, capillary, and neuronal space, creating the false impression that it has disappeared. Back in a minute. Thank you. So normally this is going to be Broken News Thursday, but I decided because the Broken News book, the guy was spending more time analyzing and trying to fix the RNC and the DNC than CNN and Fox News. So I'm going to switch over to this book here called Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. And this is the introduction.
Introduction. On November 16th, 2018, CNN's Don Lemon hosted a panel discussion about white women who voted for Donald Trump. There was no real news peg for the story. The president hadn't spent the morning tweeting about anything specific, and it was 10 days after the midterm elections, which Lemon nevertheless valiantly torqued into an awkward hook for the panel. A wave of women, white, black, and brown, are sweeping into office after the 2018 election. Does Donald Trump still have the support of a majority of white women? And if so, why is that? Maybe that's why the panel happened at all. A Friday night capping off a slow news week was as good an opportunity as any to bring up the increasingly hot topic of white supremacy. In fact, the only remarkable thing about the panel was how unremarkable it was, one of 1,000 such panels that have graced American airwaves in recent years. Lemon's guests were Kirsten Powers, a senior CNN political analyst, Alice Stewart, a CNN commentator playing the supporting role of token Republican, and Stephanie Jones Rogers, a professor of history at UC Berkeley, whose book, They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, had been cited in an article on Vox, a liberal opinion site that caters to millennials. Powers had much to say about Donald Trump's female supporters. People will say that they support him for reasons other than his racist language, she told Lemon. They'll say, well, I'm not racist. I just voted for him because I didn't like Hillary Clinton. And I just want to say that that doesn't make you not racist. It actually makes you racist, Powers explained. As for why white women do it, she went on, I think we have to remember that the white patriarchal system actually benefits white women in a lot of ways. Professor Jones Rogers concurred, tying support for Trump to slavery. So, as a historian, I explore white women's economic investments in the institution of slavery, she said. And what that has led me to understand is that there's this broader historical context that we need to keep in mind when we're looking at white women's voting patterns today. And as we look at their support, their overwhelming support of Donald Trump. Lemon jumped in to note that just over half of white women had voted for Trump, hardly what would constitute overwhelming support. Jones Rogers clarified, what I meant by overwhelming was emotionally overwhelming. The sole Republican, Alice Stewart, was briefly allowed to respond and voiced her resentment at being called racist for her vote for Trump, whom she chose for his policies. But Powers interjected, it's not just Republican women who have a problem with racism, but all white women, indeed all white people. Every white person benefits from an inherently racist system that is structurally racist, so we are all part of the problem, Powers said. Jones Rogers heartily agreed. It was a scene as inescapable today as it would have been rare 10 years ago. There's a view that's taken hold of America's national news media. It's not a new one. It's long been a staple among academics and activists. But increasingly it has made its way out of the hallowed hallways of sociology and ethnic studies departments and seeped into America's mainstream via our leading national news media outlets. It's the belief that America is an unrepentant white supremacist state that confers power and privilege on white people, which it systematically denies to people of color. Those who hold this view believe an interconnected network of racist institutions infects every level of society, culture, and politics, imprisoning us all in a power binary based on race, regardless of our economic circumstances. And the solution, according to those who hold this view, is not to reform institutions that still struggle with racism, but to transform the consciousness of everyday Americans until we prioritize race over everything else. This view is known as anti-racism, or by the shorthand of being woke, slang for being awake to what's called systemic or institutional racism. And though many in this ideological camp pay lip service to the idea that race is a social construct rather than a biological reality, they view race as the most important and inescapable fact of American life, reducing America's past and present to a binary of white oppressors and black and brown victims. For a long time, this view was the province of far-left activists and academics. But over the past decade, it's found its way into the mainstream. By and large, through liberal media outlets like the New York Times, NPR, MSNBC, The Washington Post, Vox, CNN, The New Republic, and The Atlantic. Once fringe, the idea that America is an unabated white supremacist country and that the most important thing about a person is the immutable fact of their race is the defining paradigm of today, the one now favored by white liberals to describe our current moment. And it was when white liberals began espousing this woke narrative that it went from being mainstream to being an obsession, and even, most recently, to being an outright moral panic. The obsessive enthusiasm for wokeness among white liberals created a feedback loop with their media outlets that was then reinforced through a new and staggering uniformity of views across once distinct publications and news channels, showing up in ubiquitous television segments like Don Lemon's and articles like "Is the White Church Inherently Racist?" and "The Housewives of White Supremacy," and "When Black People Are in Pain, White People Just Join Book Clubs," and "How White Women Use Themselves as Instruments of Terror." The bread and butter of the New York Times and the Washington Post. Where did this obsession come from? The election of Donald Trump is often given the credit for the national liberal news media's newly woke outlook. Trump was so extreme in his disregard of liberal mores, so willing to offend with comments that were sometimes casually racist, comments that were amplified and justified throughout conservative and right-wing news outlets, that America's liberal camp, including the liberal media, swung hard to the left. This is true. The mainstream media certainly molded itself around Trump, whose presidency was a major gift to MSNBC and CNN and the New York Times. Outlets that were facing a bleak outlook are now thriving thanks to the ratings and clicks that the Trump stories generated. But the woke moral panic mainstreamed by the liberal news media had actually been underway for at least 5 years before Trump appeared on the scene. It began around 2011, the year the New York Times erected its online paywall. It was then that articles mentioning racism, people of color, slavery, or oppression started to appear with exponential frequency at the Times, BuzzFeed, Vox, the Washington Post, and NPR, according to sociologists tracking these developments. And as we will see throughout this book, this radical shift to the left on issues of identity was rooted in a longer-term trend in the media that has much more to do with class than it does with politics or race. For hidden behind a story that looks like it's about race is a story about class, even caste. The fact is, journalism has become a profession of astonishing privilege over the past century, metamorphosing from a blue-collar trade into one of the occupations with the most highly educated workforces in the United States. And along with this status revolution has come the radicalization of the profession on questions of identity, leaving in the dust anything commensurate to a similar concern with economic inequality. Put simply, journalists rising to the American elite and journalists mainstreaming radical ideas about race are two sides of the same coin, as we will see through a sociological, historical, and economic analysis of the evolution of American journalism that has taken place over the past 200 years. The recent obsession with identity has allowed journalists to pretend, indeed to believe, they are still speaking truth to power, still fighting on behalf of the little guy, even after they have themselves ascended to the ranks of the powerful, even when they are speaking down to an audience who, in more cases than not, have less than them on every measurable scale. It has quite simply been a displacement exercise. Instead of experiencing economic guilt about rising inequality and their status among America's elite, members of the news media, along with other highly educated liberals, have come to believe that the only inequality that matters is racial inequality. The only guilt that matters is white guilt, the kind you can do absolutely nothing to fix, given that it's based on something as immutable as your skin color. In other words, despite a no doubt well-intentioned desire to ameliorate racial inequality, their enthusiasm for the language of wokeness has allowed affluent white liberals to perpetuate and even excuse a deeply unequal economic status quo with the help of the national liberal news media. If journalists once fought the powerful on behalf of the powerless, In 21st century America, they are the powerful. While the average pay for a journalism job is quite low at around $40,000 a year, that's because entry-level jobs pay so little. At the higher levels, journalists now make quite a bit more than the average American. More importantly, journalists now have social and cultural power, and they are overwhelmingly the children of economic elites. After all, to even be able to make it on $30,000 a year while living in the most expensive cities in America, the only ones left with a functioning journalism industry thanks to the rise of the internet and the collapse of local newspapers, you have to come from a family with enormous economic privilege who can help you out. Once a blue-collar trade, journalism has become something akin to an impenetrable caste. And what journalists have done with that power, perhaps inadvertently, is to wage a cultural battle that enhances their own economic interests against the less educated and struggling American working class. Once working class warriors, the little guys taking on America's powerful elites, journalists today are an American elite, a caste that has abandoned the working class and the poor as it rose to the status of American elite. And a moral panic around race has allowed them to mask this abandonment under the guise of social justice. Take Kirsten Powers, one of Lemon's guests on that panel in 2018. Powers had been the resident liberal at Fox News until CNN poached her in 2016 for a rumored $950,000 yearly salary. But for Powers to traverse the ideological distance from Fox to CNN and take advantage of that nearly $1 million salary, she had to undergo a woke metamorphosis. In 2015, while still employed by Fox, Powers had written a book called The Silencing: How the Left is Killing Free Speech. But in the intervening years, she repented. I was too dismissive of real concerns by traumatized people and groups who feel marginalized and ignored, she wrote in a mea culpa in her USA Today column. Newly reformed as a believer in America as an enduring white supremacist state, Powers was able to take to CNN and join a Berkeley professor writing for Vox, a left-wing website for highly educated millennials, and another mainstream television host who were all in total agreement about how racist every white person in America is, especially anyone who voted for Trump. There was a bit of slippage between those two contradictory positions. That Lemon panel in 2018, typical in every way of our national news media, featured two mainstream television hosts worth $12 and $25 million apiece with annual salaries close to $1 million a year who were convinced that white supremacy is thriving in America, that it afflicts all white people. When people hear privilege, they think that means I'm like a richie rich and I'm living a rich life. That's not what it means, Powers, with her estimated $25 million in the bank, patiently explained later in the CNN segment without any apparent irony. It just means you have a privilege that people of color don't have. Journalists have always been more liberal than their fellow countrymen. But in the past, this liberalism was checked by their publishers, who were often the owners of large corporations, or Republicans, or both. They wanted their newspapers and their news stations to appeal to the vast American middle, which meant that journalists were not at liberty to indulge their own political preferences in their reporting. But as we will see at great length throughout this book, this countervailing force to journalists' own liberal tendencies has evaporated in the digital age. The business model today encourages building a niche audience, more often than not a highly educated, highly affluent, highly liberal niche audience. And it is this white, liberal, affluent audience and the news corporations courting them that are fueling the moral panic around race. Open the New York Times style section with a cover story that profiles a Black Lives Matter activist, and you'll find features about wealthy New Yorkers fleeing the city during the pandemic and purchasing $2 million homes in Vermont. T Magazine, the fashion magazine of the New York Times, recently showcased Angela Davis on the front cover and an ad for a Cartier watch on the back cover. These are not in tension with each other, but rather two sides of the same coin. This perfect alignment of journalistic and corporate interests is one of the great ironies of the woke culture war. It makes individual journalists feel like heroes while making their bosses and shareholders and themselves even richer. The identity culture war allowed journalists to cast our nation as hopelessly divided along partisan and racial lines as a smokescreen for the actual impenetrable and devastating division that is happening along class lines. For the racial moral panic obscures the real divide separating America into two groups. It is not a political or racial divide, but an economic and cultural one, a giant and ever-growing chasm separating the college-educated from those they disdain and who have started to return the favor. The media's obsession with race has worked like a giant shield, hiding this chasm from view, enabling it and perpetuating it by pretending that another divide exists that is even more impenetrable and more important. In so doing, members of a meritocratic elite who see themselves as liberal have helped perpetuate historic levels of inequality. And it would have been impossible to do without the news media. At the end of his career, in his 1907 retirement speech, Joseph Pulitzer wrote up his credo for journalism. He was adamant about the most important part of journalism, the thing that made it a noble profession, one worth dedicating your life to. Never lack sympathy with the poor. Living in the Gilded Age, there were plenty of poor people for journalists to sympathize with. The streets were teeming with poor and working class Americans who had been cast out of the comforts enjoyed by the obscenely wealthy robber barons. You might think that 21st century America, a new Gilded Age in which the gap between the rich and the poor and working class is wider than it has been in living memory, would provide another such opportunity for American journalists to sympathize with the lower classes. You would be wrong. In a way, this book is a response to Thomas Frank's 2005 book, What's the Matter with Kansas? Frank sought to answer a question that had bedeviled liberals since they lost the white working class vote to Republicans a generation earlier. How is it that working class people vote for Republicans whose free trade, small government agenda rewards the rich and harms the poor? Why don't they vote for Democrats whose welfare programs would help them? Frank argued that Republicans had whipped the white working classes into a state of agitation with a culture war. He called it backlash culture, that cast liberal elites as a worthy foe, contemptuous of the beliefs and values of working class Americans. But Frank's answer really begs the question, what is it about this culture war that made it compelling enough for the working classes to abandon their own economic interests? In a later book called Listen Liberal, Frank discovered that the Democrats had abandoned the working class too. At least the Republicans didn't sneer at them while offering them nothing. But Frank got it backward. As we will explore in depth in Chapter 4, conservative media outlets like Fox News aren't turning working class voters into conservatives. The channel is conservative because it services working class viewers, the very people whom the liberal media abandoned in the 60s to pursue affluent readers and viewers. Frank's great contribution was in posing the question he failed to answer. How can a culture war lead people to abandon questions of economics? And in his apt analysis of the grammar underlying all successful culture wars. For a culture war to succeed, Frank wrote, it needs to be waged against a problem that can never be solved. Take the pro-life movement. Stopping all abortion is, by definition, impossible. Rather than a problem, this makes it a perfect subject for a culture war. As a culture war, the backlash was born to lose, writes Frank. Its goal is not to win cultural battles, but to take offense conspicuously, vocally, even flamboyantly. Indignation is the great aesthetic principle of backlash culture. Ironically, Frank points out, the conservative backlash did not follow a period of intense liberalization, but rather a major conservative coup. With Bill Clinton gone, but the free market economic policies he adopted from the right firmly in place, labor unions were toast, regulations were crumbling, and the wealthy never had it so good. The right can't simply declare victory and get out, Frank argues. It must have a haughty and despicable adversary so that its battle on behalf of the humble and victimized can continue. Whether or not this is an accurate description of the right is for others to adjudicate, but it perfectly articulates the principles that have guided the mainstreaming of wokeness into a new culture war around race. Like Frank's conservatives, white liberals have bought into an ideology that at first seems to undermine their own interests. They cast them as irredeemably racist because every white person is stained by their whiteness. And just like the right's forever culture war arrived on the scene after the Clinton era obviated the need to fight over economic policy, the woke culture war has arrived to respond to what should have been good news. Americans have gotten radically less racist by every measure we have. This is in no way to deny the history or the lingering presence of racism in America. Things like mass incarceration and police brutality continue to impact Black and Latino men disproportionately. A history of racist policies like redlining is responsible for some of the remaining wealth gap between white and Black families. Hate crimes against Latinos rose throughout the presidency of Donald Trump, and the white supremacist organizations at the fringe of American society have been using the internet to organize more effectively. Our public schools remain effectively segregated by race, and a larger percentage of Black and Latino Americans than white Americans are stuck in intergenerational poverty. These problems are real, and they are urgent. As Dr. King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The news media, which sets the agenda for politicians by telling voters what to care about, which issues matter, and which issues must be redressed, absolutely must cover issues of institutional racism wherever it exists to help us as a society to eradicate it once and for all. The problem is, this isn't what the national liberal news media is doing. Instead, it has mainstreamed a moral panic around the very idea of race, one that goes well beyond covering real problems, proposing a culture war rather than real solutions. Solutions are in fact anathema to this project because it views the very real vestiges of racism not as remaining problems to be solved, but rather as proof that racism is baked into the DNA of America, even proof that racism is the DNA of America, as present and inescapable in the hearts of well-meaning whites as it is in the actions of avowed white nationalists. This analysis is deeply misguided. Not only is it a misrepresentation of what the facts show at every juncture, but this mistaken reading of America has allowed the national liberal news media to obscure from view and even perpetuate the rapacious economic inequality that is only growing in America, and which afflicts working class and poor people of all races. Certainly, many of the journalists writing in American newspapers and opining on America's airwaves about white supremacy have pure intentions. Many believe they are fighting a moral war against injustice. Many journalists are driven by the desire to make the world a better place and are truly motivated by the desire to give voice to the voiceless, to speak truth to power. And yet, it's clear, even to people who revile racism and who are desperate to live in a more equal society, that something has gone wrong. Something else has taken hold in America's newsrooms that has made the narrative of America as a white supremacist state the ideological narrative of our time. Journalists who dissent from this worldview have learned to keep their mouths shut or face massive public censure and humiliation or even lose their jobs. And those jobs are few and far between, with the journalism industry collapsing in on itself, half the size it was just 12 years ago. The pressure to keep your job and not offend is immense. But it's not journalistic ethics that has become the measure of a journalist's worth, the deciding factor in whether or not they have a job. It's absolute obeisance to the woke worldview. And it's not just their fellow journalists who are pushing this view. It's their publishers who have recognized a rapacious market for wokeness among the affluent liberal audiences they court. Why are affluent white liberals so eager to believe we're living in a white supremacist state and that they are the beneficiaries, the very handmaidens of white supremacy? There are a number of explanations. In his 2007 book, White Guilt, How Blacks and Whites Together Destroyed the Promise of the Civil Rights Era, Shelby Steele argues that the success of the civil rights movement resulted in a crisis of moral authority in white America when it recognized its collective role in this sin of racism. Writing in the 1990s, the historian Christopher Lasch argued that the left had begun to portray the nation, the neighborhood, and even the commitment to a common standard as racist as part of a larger attack on populism and abandonment of the working class. More recently, in his book Hate Inc., Matt Taibbi explores how the media uses a fake notion of dissent to hide all the issues relevant to real Americans that it refuses to cover. We manufactured fake dissent to prevent real dissent, writes Taibbi in a nod to Noam Chomsky's famous work, Manufacturing Consent. And we know that historically, at least since the Russian Revolution, the intelligentsia has gone to great lengths to portray its own economic interests and power hoarding in the guise of a noble cause that works on behalf of the powerless. I think these are all pieces of the puzzle, but there's another real reason that, however unconscious, is certainly also at play, and it's this. Wokeness perpetuates the economic interests of affluent white liberals. I believe that many of them truly do wish to live in a more equitable society, but today's liberal elites are also governed by a competing commitment, their belief in meritocracy, or the fiction that their status was earned by their intelligence and talents. Today's meritocratic elites subscribe to the view that not only wealth, but also political power should be the province of the highly educated. Still, liberals see themselves as compassionate and progressive, and perhaps unconsciously, they sought a way to reconcile the inequality that their meritocratic status produces with the compassionate emotions they feel toward the less fortunate. They needed a way to be perpetually on what they saw as the right side of history without having to disrupt what was right for them and their children. A moral panic around race was the perfect solution. It took the guilt that they should have felt around their economic good fortune and political power, which they could have shared with the less fortunate had they cared to, and displaced it onto their whiteness, an immutable characteristic that they could do absolutely nothing to change. This is how white liberals arrived at a situation where instead of agitating for a more equal society, they agitated for more diverse elites. Instead of asking why our elites have risen so far above the average American, they asked why the elites are so white. Instead of asking why working class people of all races are so underrepresented in the halls of power, white liberals called the working class racist for voting for Trump. Instead of asking why New York City's public school system is more segregated than Alabama's, white liberals demanded diversity, equity, and inclusion training in their children's exorbitantly priced prep schools. In other words, wokeness provided the perfect ideology for affluent liberal whites who didn't truly want systemic change if it meant their children would have to sacrifice their own status, but who still wanted to feel like the heroes of a story about social justice, who still wanted to feel vastly superior to their conservative and even slightly less radical friends. They took a no doubt genuine abhorrence for the truly heinous ways Black Americans have been treated historically, and in some cases continue to be treated. And instead of seeing in it a call to arms to create a genuinely equal society, they used it as an excuse to withdraw from the common good and the social contract, rebranding the problem of racism to fit the solution that would most benefit them. In the process, they demonized America itself, deplatforming the working class of all races while protecting their own status. Racism is still a blight on American life, but wokeness is not how we heal. It has simply redefined the problem to the benefit of educated elites. By focusing on immutable characteristics like race, the woke moral panic has allowed economic elites to evade responsibility for their regressive view that elites should not only exist but rule. And in presenting race rather than class and income as America's deep and worsening divide, the purveyors of wokeness have ended up comforting white liberal elites, even as they have called them white supremacists. It would have been impossible without the media. Once a tool to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, today American journalism comforts the comfortable, speaks power to truth, and insists on an orthodoxy that protects the interests of the elites in the language of a culture war whose burden is given to the working class to bear. Thomas Frank asked why white working class voters were voting against their own economic interests. But in 2016, when they voted in their own economic interests, those in the media called them racists. This book tells the story of how that happened and why. Bad News is a populist critique of American journalism. But I write this book from the left, from a deep-seated dismay with rising inequality and the way the global economy has decimated the American working class, depriving them of the dignity of good jobs in a culture that sneers at them and their values. It also comes from a personal place. While I myself did not vote for Trump, many of the people I love did. I have Black and Latino friends who voted for him, poor and working class friends, family members, entire communities of good people I have met as a journalist and a private citizen who have been smeared in the media throughout Trump's presidency and ever since as the worst thing you can be. That doesn't mean this is a pro-Trump book. Like most other highly educated coastal journalists, I found him to be undignified, often indecent, and yes, sometimes racist. But you don't have to support Trump to realize that he represented something important for our nation to recognize. He spoke for many of the people who the left claims to care about, who in recent decades have been abandoned and erased from the public sphere. You do not have to support Trump to acknowledge that he exposed something dark about American journalism that was already underway when he surprised everyone by winning the presidency in 2016. He exposed the contempt the media has for middle America and for religion. The use of racism as a cudgel to protect class interests, the obfuscation of American unity on questions of equality, the elevation of a set of taste and class markers to the status of absolute truth, and the cultivation and mainstreaming of a moral panic about America as an enduring white supremacist country, while corporate America was bending over backward to appropriate the Black Lives Matter slogan. Still, this is an optimistic book. Although I am deeply critical of the direction American journalism has taken, I am also convinced that it's not too late to change course. That's why the book is so tightly focused on the media powerhouses that have seized upon and further capitalized on this trend. It is they that set the tone for the rest of the industry. That is also why there is so much space devoted to the New York Times. I take the Times to task frequently throughout this book, confident that this august institution can and probably wishes to course correct. Like most journalists, I am deeply committed to the Times. I've written for the paper, pitched op-eds to its opinion pages, and even applied for jobs there. But as a titan in the industry, the paper also sets the tone for the rest of the journalistic outlets, and the tone it has set of late is a disastrous one. Through the course of writing this book, I reached out to the New York Times to request an interview with its publisher and executive editor. Both respectfully declined to be interviewed. The truth is hard to admit. The liberal news media has abandoned the working class, allowing conservative outlets to swoop in and cater to them. And while conservative media has never taken up the economic cause of the working class and tends to view it through the impoverished lens of a rural white Christian man, it is working class people of all races, genders, and creeds whose economic story has been erased from the news media. And it's not just the economic story of the working class that has been left behind. As Chris Arnade has pointed out in his seminal book, Dignity, the real divide is cultural even more than it is economic. It is the working class culture, one that values family, place, and faith over careers and resumes and credentials, that we have excised from the public square. The cost of erasing people who are economically working class from the conversation has deepened and perpetuated inequality, a disaster for anyone who truly cares about a more just society. But the cost of erasing people who are culturally working class, President Trump's real base, for example, from public discourse in the elite liberal news media, has had similarly profound consequences. It has meant the concentration of power in the hands of the highly credentialed few, a development that spells disaster for any nation that wishes to see itself as a democracy. We need a journalism that exposes the class divide in America rather than concealing it, whereby it continues to grow. And not because the working class is worthy of your pity or your compassion. It is not only on behalf of the poor and working class that people who care about America should be invested in restructuring our institutions to better serve them. It is on behalf of democracy itself, which simply cannot thrive when power is concentrated in the hands of so few, as it is today, thanks in no small part to journalists. A press that is so solidly on the side of that powerful few, so solidly of it, that afflicts the afflicted and comforts the comfortable, will hasten our demise. And that should terrify us all.
And that was Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy by, let me see what we got here, Batya Unger Sargon. And so it'll be interesting to see whether or not she's going to be able to get to some of the real reasons about this. And because this is about wokeism, although she's making it more about the news media, which I guess is okay because they're part of the problem rather than part of the solution. But anyway, so this is not a discrete event, and that's the way she's treating it so far. It is a part of a historical process that started in the 1960s. So again, it will be interesting to see whether or not in the course of this book she goes ahead and acknowledges it. The other thing is that she's still, she says she's a lefty, but approaches this not from a left-right political philosophy standpoint, but from the standpoint of poor versus rich. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in the book as well. So back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.